In the prior video, we showed you what happens when you enter the level 1 data. And just to refresh, we showed an example here. We just made up some numbers. We have, for example, a population served of 500,000 people in the sample laboratory. They are charged for utilities, but not telecommunications. So some of the basic information from the opening page. Casework level 1 only wanted to be able to look at a couple things here. How many cases in each investigation area do you have? And what were the full-time equivalent employees in each of these areas? And that included if there was anything centrally allocated through administration and support. With that information, along with the very base information on expenditures, expenditure level 1 data just wanted to know at laboratory-wide what were the capital expenditures in the current year. And by capital, we're looking at the direct capital expenditures, service contracts on instruments, equipment leasing, and so on, chemicals, reagents, and consumables, and then other overhead expenditures, and then a detailed listing of the personnel expenditures in each of these investigation areas. What we showed is that with that information alone, you have enough information to begin getting data back. And we did this to be able to show people the minimum information that they needed to be able to participate in the project. And so the summary measures came up, it collected against some totals, allocated the FTE, full-time equivalent employees, from administration and their associated expenditures, and then began some of the very base measures that we would see here. So for example, what is the caseload per 100,000 population? So some comparison in terms of what's coming in. We also have this key measure here on the cost per case. Now, it only provides results for the areas in which you report. As you worked your way on, average compensation was given. And some other key areas, measures with respect to productivity, cases handled per full-time equivalent employee, and so on, a split on the budgetary expenditures, what percentage allocation went in each area, which gave some ability to compare. So that's the minimum, but you do get some really key results back from that. What we want to show here with the level 2 data is this gives the much broader amount of data that you might be able to provide. So there are definitions for each of these things. So if you look at the glossary on further tabs that we have down here, but we have things like such as this with respect to casework. How many items were submitted? Of the items that are submitted across all cases, how many of those were outsourced? How many items were actually examined internally? From those items that you examine internally, how many samples were taken? Of those samples, how many tests were performed? How many reports were written for each case? So base information, you might have some, you might not have all of this, but let's suppose that we've got some information for a particular laboratory. So with respect to its blood alcohol, let's suppose that it had 6,000 samples taken from the items that are submitted. But they don't keep track of tests. Well, that's fine with that. On DNA casework, well, it could be that they've got much more detail, there were 8,000 items submitted, and an item might be something like a t-shirt that has a stain on it, or underwear, or something of that. Were any of these outsourced or not? Whatever you have. So how much of this did you examine? And let's suppose they examined 7,500 of these, and out of those they took 20,000 samples. Okay, and perhaps they even know how many tests were conducted in each of these. So let's say it was 100,000 tests. Okay, how many reports were written? Well, let's suppose there were 1,950 reports that were written. So you could provide any level of detail that you might have in these areas, and the same holds true for any of the other areas. You'll notice that what you had entered on the prior page is going to appear here. So let's just give some key here with respect to samples. Let's suppose there's 4,500 samples taken there. In the case of toxicology antemortem, let's suppose there were 2,000 samples. In the case of toxicology postmortem, let's suppose that there were 4,000 samples, whatever it might be. And then you just complete what you might have on any of these, say 1,400 reports. Here, let's say 800 reports. And just moving our way down to toxicology postmortem, let's suppose that there were 1,250 reports. Okay, so we have that key information that's given in here. Other things that you might be able to provide in level 2. And again, you only provide what information you have. You don't have to provide everything. Here, turnaround time is an important question that we frequently are going to deal with. And we have two metrics. Median turnaround time, again, we're looking for typical. You may be able to use average. It depends on what you collect, and that's fine. What we're trying to get in here is some sense of typical. We go with median instead of average simply because you could have a few cases that really throw everything off, that they've been held off for a very long period of time, whereas median is going to give us more idea of what is indeed typical. So is it when do you count in your lab? So we don't expect to get both measures. We're happy if we do, but generally we want to find how do you keep this? And we did this because we want to make sure that people compare apples with apples. So let's just take a look at this. Let's suppose from the first submission in a case, you start the countdown. So let's suppose for blood alcohol, it's 15 days from when that happens. In the case of DNA casework, let's suppose it's 100 days. In the case of serology, let's suppose it's 60 days. Toxicology antemortem, 55 days. And toxicology postmortem, let's say it's 40 days, whatever it might be. We also have some information here on open cases at the end of each year and how many of those are older than 30 days. And again, that's just to be able to look at the traditional measure of backlog here. So let's suppose in the case of blood alcohol that there are 100 open area cases, but there's only 20 of these that are older than 30. In the case of DNA, let's suppose it's 250, and out of those, let's say 150 are older than 30 days. And so on. You go down for each of these for whatever it is that you might have. We can look at serology, and let's suppose it's 75, and there are 35 that are open that long. Toxicology antemortem, let's suppose it's 70 cases, and out of those, say 50 are older than 30 days. And in case of toxicology postmortem, let's suppose it's 85 cases, and out of those, there are 30 that are out more than 30 days. Okay, this last thing that we ask in here is with respect to operational staff, full-time equivalent employees. And this is simply if we want to be able to break some things down from your total FTE to what we would have here. So if you've got it, you put it in. So suppose this is 1.5. And in the instance of DNA casework, let's suppose that is 10, and so on. You can put these down here for any of these that you might have. The last couple things are some specialty items. In the case of digital evidence, which we didn't put in here, is how many gigabytes were examined in the lab. And in the case of DNA database, we do ask some things with respect to offenders versus arrestees, how many of the entries are coming from those areas. So great. If that's all you can provide, summary measures are going to pick up a lot more information at this point. So you can see some of the things that are happening in here. And particularly when we begin to examine the ratios, you'll notice now we're getting some information on all of these measures here, the reports per 100,000, the tests per 100,000, and so on. Likewise, cost per case, cost per item in some areas, cost per sample, cost per test, cost per report. And these are all comparables that you can look at with respect to other labs that perhaps might be like you, or how do you fit into any of these? So you can see a great bit of detail that we weren't able to see, and a lot of it is finding the appropriate metrics. So does productivity at the samples level make more sense, or at the testing level or report level? Which of these are going to work its way through? And then, of course, you find here in terms of turnaround time, backlog per case or percentage backlogs, things that may be helpful to be able to track over time. That's just with the additional casework information. And again, you didn't need to provide every piece of information, just what you had. But once you provide what you have, you get much more detail out of the report. And the same thing is true with respect to expenditures. In the expenditures level 1, we just asked for the totals in each of these areas. We said, well, we were just going to assign these across the laboratory according to the size of some of the other units. In level 2, it says, well, you can give a lot more specific information. So first thing, in general, across the laboratory, not only your current expenditures this year for capital, but what about the prior 4 years? And the reason we ask these for the prior 4 years is that capital equipment by IRS code is, for laboratories, fits into what is known as a 5-year class. So the current year and the 4 prior, we give a much more accurate depiction. So let's suppose that over the prior 4 years, that the amount of capital expenditures were $1.2 million. So not exactly $350,000 a year, but not that far from it. So we're going to come up with a better measure. Even further, you may have looked in here and said, well, I can tell you out of the 350 capital expenditures, DNA casework actually had 200,000 of those. And so the amount that we're going to allocate over the other areas is going to be much more fine-tuned at this point when we know these specific allocations. Likewise, on the prior 4 years, let's suppose that 750,000 was just DNA-related expenditures. And whether you have more information or not for any of the other areas, it will adjust and allocate to this and be able to work its way through. Okay. Likewise here with chemicals, reagents, consumables, and gases, we just asked for that for the total. But you might know a lot more information in this sense here. So perhaps you know that 75,000 was actually for the DNA area, and perhaps toxicology, it was 50,000 in one area and 80,000 in another. You'll get much more specific information out of this. And then we're here with respect to other expenditures. And this would be your overhead items. So for the entire lab at 450,000, if you knew the allocation for any area, you can put that in. If you don't put it in. So with that, what it's going to do is to allow us to fine-tune any of these expenditure allocations by area. So you'll see that a lot more has gone towards this DNA expenses and what they're going to have, because we were able to give a lot more specific information on their capital expenditures. And with this, you get a much more fine-tuned sense of what is the cost per case, for example, or cost per item. And this is per item examined internally, cost per sample. Always a piece of information that is generally of great interest, and particularly in things like DNA or blood alcohol. But you may find that's true here in any of the other cases that we examined here, serology, biology, and the toxicology areas. Cost per report, okay, that's coming up. Average comp, okay, that's going to stay the same because of how we allocate it. But you also have these productivity numbers that we were showing, and you have some things with respect to turnaround time that we were able to add in here, as well as how are you doing over time with respect to your backlog? What's going up as a percentage? Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? How do I compare to other laboratories? So that's what the level 2 measures do. It gives us greater precision based on any information that you might have. I encourage you to take a look at that, and certainly to be able to look at any of the items that we have within our LabRAT tool.